Why be afraid of fear? Let's befriend it. Most of us have grown up hearing that fear is the enemy. We are told to suppress fear, we are told to overcome fear, we are told to push it aside. But what if I told you we all misunderstood the word fear? What if I told you that fear is not the enemy? In fact, fear helps us grow. Fear helps us survive. Fear helps us in becoming a better human being. In today's session, we'll explore that fear is not only natural, it's good. Not only useful, it's essential. In fact, I'll be using arguments from philosophy, psychology, just to prove that fear is useful. Long before fear as an emotion was spoken about in therapy sessions and self-help books, it was a survival system that was hardwired in human biology. In fact, fear helped our ancestors survive. Fear told us when to run, when to hide, when to prepare for a battle. In fact, people who lack fear are the ones who didn't last long. Fear triggers what is called as fight or flight response. In fact, it's a full body alert mechanism where your heartbeat increases, your muscles tense, your senses sharpen, and all this happens in a second without any conscious thought. In fact, it's body's ways of preparing you to meet a danger. Today, fear not only just protects our physical safety, it also contributes to our social and psychological well-being. For example, fear of failure drives a student to study hard. Fear of rejection affects how we present ourselves in relationships. Fear of death shapes religion, philosophy. In fact, it gives a sense of purpose to humans. Scholars now have reframed the way we look at fear. Scholars no more consider fear as something primitive that holds us back. In fact, they see fear as a sophisticated emotion that impacts human life at multiple levels. So let's look at the positive impact of fear on human lives. What if fear is not always the problem? Then what is it? Scholars nowadays argue that fear can be a powerful motivator. For example, a student who's afraid of failure, it's the fear that may motivate him to work hard, that may motivate him to study late, that may motivate him to change his behavior. Now, fear here is not paralyzing. In fact, fear is energizing. Let's take one more example. Suppose there's an employee who's afraid of losing his job. It's the fear of loss that may provoke him, that may drive him to work hard, be creative, take initiative. Philosopher Robert Solomon critiques the way we traditionally looked at courage. In fact, people traditionally looked at courage as being fearless, whereas philosopher Solomon says, courage is not about being fearless. Courage is acting wisely in the presence of fear. Interesting statement, right? Philosophers like Solomon make us look at fear from a new perspective. What they to convey us is, let's not be ashamed of being afraid. Let's not be embarrassed about our fears. In fact, what they're encouraging us to do is to listen to our fears, understand them, and find a way to respond to those fears. Some scholars argue that fear can be a great teacher. In fact, it reveals what we truly value. For example, if you're afraid of losing someone, that shows you care about that person, that shows the person matters to you. Similarly, if you're afraid of public humiliation, that shows that you're very worried, you care about your reputation, you care about your public image. Fear points us to things that we're emotionally invested in. Philosophers have identified different kinds of fear, and each and every fear has an important role to play in our lives. First up are the primal fears. These are the most basic fears. It's more instinctual. These are fears about loud noises, darkness, heights, and these fears are hardwired in a nervous system. In fact, these fears made a lot of evolutionary sense, and these fears kick in even now when they alert us to danger. Next up are the social fears. These are fears we learn. These fears include fear of embarrassment, fear of humiliation, fear of rejection. In fact, it's these fears that prevent us from speaking in public. that makes us very conscious in public. And these fears play a very important role in shaping our social behavior. In fact, these fears drive the way we behave in public spaces. Some amount of social fear is good. It keeps us polite and considerate. But too much of it restricts us. The third is moral fear. This fear is tied to ethical responsibility and conscience. And here individuals have fear in terms of harming somebody, fear of betraying one's own personal values. Here we have fear of taking decisions in situations of ethical dilemma. So here there's a lot of moral values and principles at stake. Having moral fears is not a flaw. In fact, it's a sign that you're a very thoughtful, accountable person. Now the last and the big one, fear of death, fear of meaninglessness, fear of the unknown. Now this is called existential fears. I understand existential fears can be overwhelming, but trust me, it is this fear that drives us to reflect. It's this fear that makes humans look for purpose in life. It's this fear that makes us look for meaning in our life. The message here is simple and powerful, that not all fears are equal. In fact, understanding fears help us in the way we deal with it with clarity and intention. Scholars not only pointed out the helpful side of fear, they also pointed out that fear can be a tool of exploitation. Governments, media, advertisers, they often stoke fear and manipulates people's fears. For example, governments sometimes talk about war, terrorism, they talk about economic collapse, just to justify surveillance or restrictive economic policies. So sometimes the fear may be real, sometimes the fear may be exaggerated, but the fear has an impact on public behavior. One more example. The media thrives on fear. They sensationalize headlines. They keep the viewers engaged. Forget media, talking about viewers. Even movie industry does it. Look at the amount of audience we have for horror movies or horror shows. And what all these media and the movie industry does is they keep the viewers hooked by triggering this basic emotion called fear. One needs to understand that fears are not always fake, but yes, sometimes they're amplified and manipulated. This is where fear requires critical awareness. Next time when you're afraid of something, ask yourself this question: are my fears grounded in reality, or is it because of something else? If you can understand that, if you can generate that critical awareness, trust me, you'll use fear very well. Trust me, you'll never be manipulated again. This brings me to the last part of the session. How do we manage fear without letting it dominate us? There are some few suggestions which I borrowed from philosophers. Let's look at them. The first advice that philosophers give to manage fear is, they say, be aware. Understand your fears. Label them. Vague fears creates anxiety. When you understand your fear with clarity, you'll be able to manage it much better. The next step is to treat fear as a guide. Next time, notice this. When you're afraid of something, that means fear is pointing that this is where you lack. This is where you need clarity. So fear is giving you that information. So use fear as a guide to build a certain quality called courage. Next time, when you're afraid of something, use it as a pointer to develop a certain character trait. Thirdly, and this is my favorite one, don't pretend to be fearless. Be emotionally honest. Accept your fears. Acknowledge it. Be vulnerable. Talk about it. The moment you name your fears, the fear becomes less scary. The next one is something you should listen to. Next time if you notice, we have two kinds of fear, rational and irrational. We assume a lot of fears which are very irrational. And the moment you're able to distinguish between rational and irrational fears, trust me, your life becomes much more easy. Managing fear is not about suppression, it's about integration. It's about bringing in fear into awareness, letting it to inform, not control, inform you so that you're able to use fear better, so that you're able to manage your fears better. Fear was always misunderstood. It was always seen as a sign of weakness. But in today's episode, you must have learned that fear is not all bad. Philosophers have reframed fear for us. They've pointed out that we should understand our fears. We should try using fear as a guide. We should try using fear as a motivator. We should critically analyze fears so that we understand that we are not being manipulated. So fear is not all bad. In fact, it's time we understood the value of fear. It's time we realize the question is not how to get rid of fear. The question is how to live wisely with fear. So long, happy learning.